3 different outreach reports, 3 different cities, the same exact technique, written down almost word for word. That should not happen by chance. So I started digging, and what I pulled out of the next 8 months of phone calls, Freedom of Information Act requests, and county records is the reason this video exists. The headline finding I am going to lay out for you, the one that took me almost a year to corroborate, is this. The people surviving sub-zero nights inside a parked car with no engine heat, no gas heater, and no shore power are not surviving by accident. They are not surviving by being tougher than you. They are running a quiet, refined, multi-layer engineering protocol that has been passed person to person for at least 40 years. The version I was able to verify lines up with documents I pulled from the Erie County Winter Outreach Review. It lines up with cold injury data published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's National Center for Health Statistics. It lines up with a 1,987 Forestry Service cold camp manual that nobody on the homelessness beat seems to have ever cross-referenced. The single paragraph on page 19 of that forestry manual is what the rest of this video is built around. 4 independent sources in 4 different cities confirmed they were doing exactly what that paragraph describes, and none of them had ever heard of the document. Halfway through a 4-hour phone call with a paramedic who has worked Buffalo nights for 11 winters, she said one sentence I have not stopped thinking about since. She said, the ones her crew lost were almost never the ones still outside at 3 inches the morning. The ones they lost were the ones who had panicked into a poorly chosen indoor space earlier in the evening and stopped paying attention. Stay with me, because the part of what I uncovered that matters most for you is not what happens on the street. It is what happens the week the grid goes down in your own neighborhood and the furnace stops. The investigation started, like most of them do, with a number that did not add up. In the December 2022 Buffalo blizzard, the official narrative emphasized the people who died in their vehicles. I went looking for the inverse number, the one nobody puts in a press conference. How many people slept in vehicles through that storm and walked out? Erie County's Winter Outreach Review, the one published the following spring, contained a buried subtable showing that of the unsheltered population contacted by outreach teams during the storm window, the survival rate among those who had what the report called a prepared vehicle configuration was over 90%. That phrase, prepared vehicle configuration, appears nowhere else in the document. There is no glossary, there is no appendix defining it. So I called the outreach coordinator listed on the report's cover page, and after the 3rd call, she agreed to talk on background. She walked me through what those 4 words actually mean in the field. A prepared vehicle, in the language her team uses internally, is a sedan or compact SUV in which 4 specific heat loss pathways have been individually addressed. Not 1, not 2, all 4. And the order matters because if you address them in the wrong order, you create a second problem that kills you faster than the cold would have. The 4 pathways are conduction through the floor and the metal of the doors, convection from air movement inside, outside the cabin, radiation through the glass to the open winter sky, and evaporation from breath and any damp clothing. Every survival protocol I corroborated across Buffalo, Milwaukee, Spokane, and Salt Lake City attacks those 4 inches roughly the same sequence. Every cold exposure death I read about in the medical examiner files I requested skipped at least 2 of them. That is not folklore. That is a pattern in the data. But the data only tells you the shape of the answer. It does not tell you why the shape works. For that, I had to sit down with the physics, and the physics is where the investigation got genuinely surprising. Most people assume the killer in a parked car is air temperature. It is not. The killer is conduction, and conduction is the heat loss vector almost nobody addresses correctly. A human body resting on a car seat is in continuous thermal contact with a steel chassis, that is, in turn, in continuous thermal contact with frozen pavement. That chassis will pull heat out of you at a rate roughly 25 times faster than still air at the same temperature. A retired thermal engineer I interviewed for 2 hours over the phone, a man who spent his career on Arctic pipeline insulation, put it in a single sentence. He said, "The floor is always trying to kill you first, and most people are watching the windows. The protocol the outreach coordinator describes starts at the floor for exactly that reason. Layered cardboard, the double-walled kind from appliance boxes, cut to the dimensions of the footwell and the seat base, stacked to a depth of roughly 2 inches. Cardboard reads as trash to most people. To anyone who has cross-referenced the R value tables, cardboard reads as roughly R3 per inch of dead air loft, 2 inches of stacked cardboard between a sleeping body. A frozen steel floor is doing the same insulating work as a high-end closed-cell foam pad costing $80. 2 of the 4 people I interviewed in depth had figured this out on their own. The other 2 had been shown by someone older, who had been shown by someone older. The trail, when I followed it, went back to a Minnesota construction crew in the 1970s who slept in their trucks between job sites. And from there into the forestry manual I mentioned at the top. Therefore, the second pathway, convection, becomes the next problem, and this is where the system most people would design themselves becomes lethal. The instinct is to seal the car. Tape the gaps, block the vents, make it airtight. The records I pulled from 3 separate medical examiner offices show that instinct. Followed to its conclusion is one of the more common causes of death in vehicle-occupied exposure cases. Carbon dioxide buildup in a fully sealed sedan with 1 adult breathing inside it reaches dangerous concentration in under 4 hours. The protocol the surviving community has refined does the opposite of the intuitive answer. 2 windows are cracked, not 1. They are cracked on diagonal corners of the vehicle, never on the same side, and the gap is roughly the width of a pencil. This creates a slow cross-ventilation that exchanges the cabin air completely about every 90 minutes without ever generating a felt draft. A warming center director in Spokane with 23 years on the job told me, off the record, that the diagonal crack rule is the single piece of knowledge that separates the people who wake up from the people who do not. He has watched it correlate with outcomes for over 2 decades. He said he has never once seen it written down in any official guidance distributed to the population that needs it most. That gap between what the system knows and what the system shares is in many ways the entire story of this beat. Now, if you are watching this thinking it could never be you, stay with me, because the part of what I found that matters most for you is what comes next. Picture a multi-day power outage in a deep freeze. Substation failure, ice storm, whatever the trigger. Your house is going to lose its stored heat in roughly 12 to 18 hours depending on construction. After that, your house is a slightly larger version of the parked car I have been describing. Every method I corroborated translates directly to a single room in your home, and the translation is almost effortless. You pick the smallest interior room you have, ideally one without an exterior wall, ideally a bathroom or a closet or a small interior bedroom. You move a mattress into it, you stack cardboard, blankets, couch cushions, anything with loft against the floor underneath the mattress. Because conduction through your subfloor into an unheated crawl space is your version of the steel chassis. You hang blankets over the door and over any window with an air gap between the blanket and the glass, because that air gap is doing the radiation work that mylar does in the vehicle protocol. You crack one window in an adjacent room and leave the door to your safe room slightly open at the top, creating the same diagonal cross-ventilation that prevents carbon dioxide accumulation from your own breathing and from any candle or small heat source you may be running. You do not seal the room. Sealing the room is what kills people in their houses for exactly the same reason it kills people in their cars. The retired thermal engineer told me that during the February 2021 freeze, when northern protocols got pulled south into Texas, the houses where people survived best were the ones where somebody, often without knowing why, had instinctively done some version of this. The houses where people did not survive were almost always houses that had been sealed up tight against the cold, turned into carbon dioxide chambers by their own occupants. The same 4 heat loss pathways, the same order of operations, the same physics. The only difference is the size of the box around you. But none of this is the finding I spent the longest verifying, and none of this is the reason I am making this video. The climax of the investigation, the single technique that surprised me the most and that took the longest to corroborate, came from that 1,987 Forestry Service manual, from a community archivist in Duluth who pulled a folder for me showing the same technique documented in a 1962 Fishing Fleet Safety Bulletin. The technique has a name inside the community that uses it. They call it the breath trap. The version I was able to verify works like this. Human breath, over the course of a night, releases roughly 1 liter of water vapor into the cabin air. That vapor is the silent killer in the evaporation pathway because it condenses on every cold surface in the car, soaks every textile within reach. By 3 inches the morning, your blanket is damp, your jacket is damp, your body is losing heat through evaporation at a rate that no amount of insulation can compensate for. The breath trap is a single piece of fabric, traditionally a wool scarf or a doubled cotton bandana, draped loosely over the mouth and nose in such a way that it catches the warm, moist exhalation before it enters the cabin air. Wool, specifically, because wool retains roughly 80% of its insulating value even when damp. The fabric becomes a sacrificial humidity sink. It gets damp so the rest of your layers do not. In the morning you wring it out, or you swap it for a dry one. You have effectively externalized the evaporation problem to a single replaceable component. The forestry manual describes it for cold camps. The 1962 fishing bulletin describes it for unheated wheelhouses. The 4 people I interviewed across 4 cities all do it, and 3 of the 4 called it by the same name. None of them had ever heard of the documents. The knowledge had survived for 60 years inside an unwritten oral tradition passed from person to person on park benches, in storage unit corridors, exactly preserved because the people carrying it could not afford to forget. That is the finding. That is what I came to tell you. A scrap of wool fabric, draped correctly, is the difference between waking up dry and waking up wet. Waking up wet in the cold is the difference that the medical examiner files quietly document over and over again. What I came away with after 2.5 years on this beat is a kind of respect I did not have when I started. Respect for a body of knowledge that nobody granted credentials to, that nobody published in a journal, that survived in the margins because the people carrying it had no other margin to fall back on. If you are the kind of person who trusts a source finding more than a confident opinion, you already understand why this matters, and you already understand why I keep doing this work. Of the 4 pathways I was able to corroborate across cities: conduction through the floor, convection from sealed air, radiation through the glass, and evaporation from your own breath. Which one would you reach for first if the heat went out in your house tonight? Drop it in the comments. I read every one, and the patterns in those comments have started shaping the next investigation. Subscribe if you want to keep following source survival knowledge instead of confident-sounding folklore. The next file I am opening is about the detection avoidance protocols people use to sleep in their cars in Walmart. Truck stop lots without ever being knocked on. What I have already pulled from 3 regional reports is going to change how you look at every parking lot you drive past after dark.